Hi, this is Pastor Josh from First Baptist of Queen. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday night study of a verse-by-verse walkthrough of the entire Old Testament. Tonight we're starting in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 33. Let's look. And the king lamented for Abner, saying, "Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen." And all the people wept again over him. See, David proceeds to offer a verbal lament for the people of Hebron to hear. David greatly implies that Abner was worthy of a far greater death than to merely be struck down in the city gates. He says that Abner was not bound as would a prisoner or criminal have been. David says this to seemingly say that Abner had not been guilty of any crime justifying imprisonment, much less death. He was in no need of being restrained. And what's more, he and David were at complete peace with each other. Joab violated that peace and acted in a sinfully shameful fashion. David goes so far in his lament to not just refer to Joab's actions, but he outright calls Joab wicked. And remember that Joab is standing there in his mourning clothes along with his remaining brother and all of his supporters and co-conspirators. This would have been a sign that David was really the one who was in charge. And no one, not even Joab, could defy what the king wanted to be done. It would have been humiliating for anyone to stand and publicly mourn for the person who killed their brother, and especially if he had been the one to avenge. But David was not especially concerned about whether or not Joab was going to be humiliated. Maybe he thought that Joab needed a little bit of humiliation to be brought back to usefulness. Maybe he also wanted to let people know that he was going to be a much different king than was Saul. David was not going to tolerate any kind of evil, sinful, wicked actions in his household, at least at this point in his reign. Look at verse 35. Then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was yet day. But David swore, saying, "God, do so to me and more also, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down." David had chosen to fast for the rest of the day. People in ancient times were buried very quickly because they did not have the means of keeping the body from smelling as it decayed as we do today. And many times the body would be buried the same day that the person had died. Now that might seem incredibly rushed for us today, who wait days, sometimes up to a week before having a funeral. And all these events seem to have happened over the course of possibly one single day. Abner may have left in the morning and gotten as far as that well, 1 or 3 miles away. Joab may have returned to town just after Abner had left. Then he ran in to confront David and rebuke him for allowing Abner to leave without punishment. Joab proceeded then to send a message after Abner telling him to come back to the city, that only 1, 2, 3 miles. And as soon as Abner returned, he's killed at the gate by Joab. The people would have then gone into funeral mode and worked together to get all of the elements ready for the funeral. So if it had only been one day and David had been occupied with funeral preparations and mourning, the people around him would have noticed that he refused to take any food. And then people would come to him and they insist that he must eat something, as any of us who have mourned are all too familiar with. David tells them that he is fasting as a sign of his grief for Abner. To take any food would be a violation of his acts of mourning, and he's not about to violate his mourning. Look at verse 36. And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as everything that the king did pleased all the people. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's will to put to death Abner, the son of Ner. So everybody noticed David's fasting and the other reactions to Abner's death, and they were all pleasantly amazed at David's outward feelings for Abner. The people were pleased that David honored even Abner, who had considered him to be an enemy. David's heart for the things of the Lord shone through so much that all the people began to take notice. It wasn't just the people of Judah watching him and his actions anymore. The entire country was now paying attention with great genuineness instead of being influenced by Saul's paranoia and bitterness. They all began to see David as the honorable and incredibly faithful follower of the Lord that he really was. And this only served to further endear him to them as a great leader and a great man. In addition, how far David went in his mourning rituals and responses were what convinced all of those same people that David did nothing against Abner. David had executed the man claiming to have killed the previous king, so the people believed he had nothing to do with Saul's death. And now David very publicly curses Abner's killer and very publicly displays mourning through his clothes, his weeping, his lament, and his fasting. So even though David did not at this point issue direct punishment against Joab, the people still believed that he had nothing to do with Abner's death. Look at verse 38. And the king said to his servants, "Do you know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I was gentle today, though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are more severe than I. The Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness." David says that Abner had been a truly great prince of men among all the people of Israel. And David considered it to be a great tragedy that Abner had been killed in such a way. Then David further reminds the people of the great contrast between his actions and those of Joab and Abishai. This may also be part of the reason why he chose to not lash out against Joab in violence, because Joab had been a man of violence to enact what he considered to be justice. And if David acted in kind and demanded Joab's life for the life of Abner, then he would be acting with the same kind of hostility as was Joab. David had been gentle in his words and actions compared to how the sons of Zeruiah had acted. David was not going to rule as king with the same kind of severity that Joab was demonstrating, of which Saul also showed when he was chasing after David and when he killed the priests at Nob for helping David. God is the true judge of the wicked sinner. He is the only one who carries the true authority to determine a person's guilt or innocence. And this may also be why David is restrained in his execution of justice against his nephew. Joab had taken matters into his own hands because he wanted to act himself, whereas David was going to wait on the Lord to exact justice because he is the only true just judge. Look at verse 1 of chapter 4. When Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. Now, Saul's son had two men who were captains of raiding bands. The name of the one was Baanah, the name of the other Rechab, sons of Ramon, a man of Benjamin from Beeroth. For Beeroth also is counted part of Benjamin. The Beerothites fled to Gittaim and have been sojourners there to this day. So even though Ishbosheth and Abner had not been on the best of terms after Ishbosheth's accusation of Abner and his father's concubine, Ishbosheth still considered him an ally, and he was immensely influential. Ishbosheth must not have thought that Abner had been serious about switching his allegiance to David, because once he heard that Abner had died, Ishbosheth loses heart, and all of Ishbosheth's territory was greatly dismayed because of who Abner had been to all of them, both a leader and a reminder of their first king, Saul. Then we're introduced to these two brothers. And they'd been leading some of Ishbosheth's men into small battles. These men were from the tribe of Benjamin, so they were relatives of Ishbosheth, who was also from Benjamin. Now, Beeroth was only a couple miles to the south of the town of Gibeon. And the Gibeonites, with the Beerothites included, from Joshua chapter 9, verse 17, were people who had deceived Joshua and the Israelites into making a treaty with them. Joshua had been leading the Israelites throughout the promised land, defeating all the previous inhabitants, and the Gibeonites and the surrounding villages like Beeroth came and pretended to have come from far off to make a treaty. When they really only lived a few miles away. And Joshua and the elders made a treaty with them without consulting the Lord. And this treaty still stood at the time of Saul and the time of David, and that will come into play later on in 2 Samuel. Actually, Saul's own grandfather was from Gibeon, from this area. So there's strong family ties to the city. And that proves incredibly complicated because later on when we see in 2 Samuel 21 that sometime during Saul's reign, he had gone down to Gibeon to try to kill all the people of Gibeon in that region, his own family. And the people of Beeroth, with its proximity to Gibeon, could have also had a familial connection to Saul. And it was even suggested by some commentators that the people of Beeroth may have fled to Gittaim when Saul came to kill all of the people of the area to try to, not die. Saul had struck out against his own relatives, and now the author of 2 Samuel is emphasizing that some of his own relatives are going to strike out against his son. Verse 4. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled, and as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. Now, Mephibosheth's crippled feet could have come from broken bones that in such a haste to escape could not have been set properly enough to allow for healing, or the crippling in both feet could also suggest a spinal cord injury resulting in paralyzation. Either way, Mephibosheth's story is one of great tragedy because he was crippled as a 5-year-old. When the news of Jonathan and Saul's death reached the royal family, there was an attempt to protect the members of the family who were still alive. Similarly, Abner had taken Ishbosheth to the north, to Mahanaim, to keep him safe and name him as the next king. And though Mephibosheth had been crippled, he was protected throughout the years because he was going to give David an opportunity to deliver on his covenant with Jonathan to take care of his family. And this little insertion here, verse in the middle of the Ishbosheth story, seems to interrupt what's happening. But this is going to demonstrate that through Mephibosheth, that though Mephibosheth was a direct descendant of the royal line, he would not have been considered a potential heir to the kingdom because he was unable to lead the men into battle. So Saul's legal royal line of potential contenders for the throne is going to end with Ishbosheth. Saul does have 2 other sons that are mentioned in 2 Samuel 21:8, but those sons were born to Saul's concubine Rizpah, so they would not have been thought of as sons who could inherit the throne. And then in the next verse, we're going to get back to the story of Ishbosheth, but we're going to stop here because we don't want to rush through the rest of what's happening with Ishbosheth, and we'll pick up on what happens next week. So I hope you'll come back and see what happens next week with Ishbosheth and these 2 sons of Ramon and David's response to what is going to happen.